Welcome to the Communal Practices project. It's early March now here in the Okanagan Valley. The air is chilly, but there's a certain spark of life that one can begin to feel and to hear. It's in the air. If we attend, we'll notice that spring is on its way. I am speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded land of the Sehoks people. They continue the work of their ancestors, the work of looking after and cherishing this beautiful land. And may we all join them in this work. Today, I'm in conversation with somebody who has been a friend of mine since the mid-90s. Her name is Harlene Anderson, and she is one of the originators, along with Harry Galician, of a form of practice often called collaborative practice. I see Harlene's work as an anti-colonial work. It is a practice that challenges the most basic assumptions of our colonial histories. Her work is marked by respect, humility, always learning from the other, and jointly finding ways to go on together. All of these are values that were not valued or practiced by our colonial ancestors. But these are values that we will celebrate today. It's an honor to talk today with the wonderful Harlene Anderson.
Okay, so my background up until bumping into family therapy was in traditional psychology, and I had never heard of family therapy. But everyone talked about it, as I mentioned a moment ago, with such enthusiasm. And I was a little bit suspicious. But in my family of origin, I was known as a nickname by Nosy Rosie, because I always wanted to know who was doing what, who was talking with whom, what did they say, where are you going, who was there, what did you have for dinner, et cetera, et cetera. So just always asking lots of those kinds of questions of people in my family and around me. So Nosy Rosie, I was called. And so I've always been, I would say, a curious person, curious about what's around me, what people are doing, and was certainly curious about what this thing called family therapy was. And then just all of a sudden, a poster caught my eye advertising training in family therapy. And I thought, well, nothing lost, nothing gained if you don't take a little bit of a risk and stick your nose in. So I decided to sign up for the training, not knowing what it would be. And if it was a cult, which it could have been, I would just, finish the semester or whatever and drop out, withdraw. So what happened is in the very first meeting, it was like, and I've written about this, I call it, I found something I did not know I was looking for. And that is, I began to kind of step back and reflect on some of my previous experiences, which had been as a school psychologist and in a community mental health center, and began to think about those experiences from a different way of thinking about them is all I can say. And so two of the things that really caught my attention and really seemed to fit were the notions of multiple realities and multiple contexts. And so I got very engaged. I read everything that I could. As a matter of fact, something that Lynn Hoffman had written by that time was one of the very first things that I read. I can't tell you the name of it now. It was a journal article. So as I say, the rest is history. It just so happened that the family therapy training was taught by people who had been and were still in a family therapy project at the medical school, but they had originally had a research project in which they decided to try to work with families and see what this was all about. And they had a team of 3 people because they had not worked with families. They all came from very traditional, not only psychodynamic, but psychoanalytic backgrounds and practices. And so what do you do with families? How do you deal with confidentiality? They had no idea. So they worked in a 3-person team of clinicians representing, at that time, we're talking about a long time ago, when the 3 major mental health disciplines were psychiatry, psychology, and social work. And then they also had a consultant to the team because they thought, well, we don't know what we're doing. We had best have another set of ears and eyes helping us out. So they invited a colleague as a consultant. So that's the spirit within which I stepped into this flowing river of family therapy. And they were doing some very innovative things in terms of not only meeting with families, but people from the community, whether that was a soccer coach, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, a priest at a church. It didn't matter. It was whoever was involved with this particular family and the person who was the patient. And at that time, the patient was either a child, an adolescent, or it could be an adult member from the adult unit. So that was the beginning, and I got very interested. And some of the roots in my current practice, I think, can be traced back to that. And some of the things that can be traced back are the notion of communal, that you're working with the communal context in which someone lives their everyday life.
Yeah.
And you're also, we found that the work was very brief. That when you got all these people together, you didn't know what you were going to do, but it was like something happened or something began to happen. So we began to call it that it was like the problem dissolved. Just whatever they came in for or referred for was no longer there. It just disappeared. It was no longer a concern, which we began to call alarmed concern, what people were defining as the problem. And then we began being very curious about not only what was being written at that time in family therapy, but also in terms of outside of family therapy, because it just so happened that this team that I was studying with, they were all very curious and very interested in anything like an article by Stephen Gould on the back of an airplane seat, where he was talking about nature and biology and
Stephen Jay Gould.
Pardon?
Stephen Jay Gould.
Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was one of the
his books too.
articles. So we're talking about way back.
Yeah.
It didn't matter who the article was by, but we found to be drawn to other areas in the social sciences, the natural sciences,
Yeah.
then within philosophy, because we became very interested in the notion of language. And that was the influence of the Mental Research Institute associates, because they were interested in language. And we very naively thought, well, if we can just learn the client's language and we can speak the client's language, then off we go. But what happened is that we found ourselves, as we were trying to learn and do it very carefully and delicately, the client's language, that we became very curious in what they were saying in a very different way than we had been curious before. We'd always been curious about the families, but we'd always had these more psychodynamic, child development theories, psychoanalytic theories in the back of our minds, informing how we were hearing client stories and how we were hearing their language. But what happened is that we began to realize that not only did each family have their own language, but each person within the family had his or her own language. And when I say language, I'm not just talking about words. I'm talking about any way in which we try to communicate with ourselves or with others, any way we try to articulate or express ourselves. And we began really focusing on the meaning of what people were saying, the meaning, their understandings of what was going on. So it began, our own professional positions began to dissolve and began to fade away, that we were no longer trying to be the experts who would attribute meaning to someone else's words or definition of a problem, but we would work within their definition of what the problem was, their definition of their family, the way that they organized. So we began to move away from some of the inherited things in psychotherapy. And I'm talking about, eventually I became a member of the teaching team, a supervisor, and writing a lot. And so we're talking about a long period of time, but I wanted to give you a sense of that I didn't just wake up one morning and decide I wanted to be a collaborative or collaborative dialogic practitioner, but that it evolved over a long period of time, and really being curious and reaching out and exploring and really valuing the resources, the expertise that clients bring, really valuing the notion of diversity, multi voices, multiplicity of opinions, of meanings, and that you don't have to move toward consensus, like a consensus definition of what the problem is, or a consensus idea of what the path is to solve that problem or correct that problem or make a person unpsychotic. That it really came out of working with other people. Now, early on, because we were at a medical school, and for those of you who may be familiar with medical settings, the word cooperative was used a lot, and compliant. So they talked about compliant patients, cooperative families, and we began to think, well, or at least I did, this was kind of one of my contributions, that we're not talking about being compliant with, cooperating with, we're talking about collaborating with, doing something together, doing something with another person, and that the expertise that I or a colleague brought to the therapy was not an expertise in how another person should or should not live their life, but it was really more an expertise in how to create a particular kind of relationship and a particular kind of conversational process, which then began to, first, we were labeled as, language systems therapist. But what happened is that you may or may not be familiar with Tom Anderson, the Norwegian, whose team developed the idea of the reflecting team. And we were very influential in having Tom begin to think of a reflecting process, not in terms of a team that meets and does something, but you're really talking about a process. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so we became very good colleagues with Tom Anderson. He was a big influence. Also at that time, we had met with Lynn Hoffman several times. I lived in Boston for a while, and Harry Galician would come up to visit my husband and myself. And we sometimes would meet with Lynn and just check in, have lunch or have breakfast or something, and see what she was thinking, what she was doing, and share what we were doing. And then eventually met Chris Kinman.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of a brief history. I don't know.
That was really helpful.
Okay.
Maybe just if I can ask a couple of questions in response to that. You've had some significant partnerships through the years, and one of them, in writing at least, was with Harry Galician. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that friendship and that relationship and kind of what you developed together.
Okay, he was really, I would say, my mentor. Yep. Maybe informally, we never called it a mentor-mentee relationship, but we thought of ourselves as colleagues. He was a very curious person, a very irreverent person, somewhat like Chris is, Lynn Hoffman was, in terms of challenging the status quo. He was extremely well-read. Well-versed. He could just get up anywhere and talk about anything. And I began watching very, very carefully everything he did and everything that he said. I knew I could not be a Harry. I could not imitate him, because at that time when I first met him, I guess he was maybe in his late 40s, early 50s. I don't know the age that he was at that time. But when I first met him, I was like in my late 20s and much less experienced, certainly in terms of family therapy and in terms of psychology in general. So I really, really looked up to him and kept thinking, you know what, I want to learn everything that I can from him. And I learned a lot of things from him that I didn't realize at the time that I was learning. But again, not in terms of trying to duplicate or emulate what he was doing, but to try to understand it and to try to be aware. And after he died at a very early age, well, I think early 67, and very suddenly of a heart problem. And what happened is that I would begin to meet people after he died who would tell lots of Harry stories. But one of the things that always seemed to surface was no matter where they were, if they were talking with Harry, they felt like they were the only person and the most important person in the room. So we're talking about 5-minute casual conversations in a line for coffee at a conference, or maybe more in-depth ones at a asking a question at a workshop and Harry's response. So people really felt respected, and I began to think in terms of not necessarily presence in the way that it's often written in the literature, but what I began to call authentic presence. And again, the whole notion of collaboration, doing something with another person, and that's in my work really, really important. And then what began to happen, because Harry knew so many people in so many fields and was very well known in the community, that we began to be asked to do unusual things outside of family therapy, like consult with a team at a mental health center, or to consult with a university family therapy program. So and both of us began to think this, but I've really carried it forward since Harry's death. And that is that I began to challenge family therapy because I began to have the idea that it was much too insulated and isolated, and had really not realized the potential that it had and that it offered for our cultures and for our societies, and not only within the United States and with English speaking worlds, but globally.
Yeah.
And so now I work all over the world, except during this pandemic, I'm zooming around. Like recently, where have I zoomed to? Brazil, Mexico, Denmark, Germany, Canada, again, recently Canada today. So right now I'm doing much more with other kinds of systems than family systems, but I still do have an association with the university and their marriage and family therapy program, and with the Houston Galveston Institute, which is one of the organizations that I co-founded, along with one called the Taos Institute, which Chris is also associated with. And so I think that having met family therapy and the people in family therapy, particularly people like Harry Galushan and Lynn Hoffman and Tom Anderson, that I am a person that I would never have become in terms of the importance and value for me of always being respectful with other people, no matter who they are, what walk of life they come from, what their political orientation is. Although I might say that one currently is a big challenge.
Yeah, especially for you in Texas.
In Texas, yes, keep up with the news and know about the leadership politically in Texas. But so respecting another person, valuing their voice, valuing the expertise that they can bring, valuing that I do have an expertise, but again, as I said a few minutes ago, that it's not in how another person should or should not live their life. So I like to pride myself in thinking that I can step into most any kind of venue and say something. I don't know what it might be. I certainly can't lecture on a lot of subjects, but there are a lot that I could at least talk about. And I think it was like I would just be in awe when Harry could stand up when somebody would ask him a question about something. And it was like, oh my gosh, he had read this or he had read that or he had heard about it. And he was just extremely informative and articulate. Now, I am by no means on that level, but I do know how to engage other people in conversation.
Oh, yes, you are on that level.
And engage people in relationships.
Yes,
So
yeah.
with this orientation toward philosophy, and that was a lot of Harry's influence, because he was educated by the Jesuits. For those of you who may be Catholic, which I am not, and I don't know a lot about that, but I do know that the Jesuits are usually known for their educational programs. So he went through Jesuit schools all the way through school, and I think all the way to a university, but he didn't get his doctorate from a Jesuit school, as far as I know, because it was the University of Michigan. So that's just a little bit. There have just been so many things that have influenced me. Chris, it's just a challenge to pull them all out.
I have to ask you about your relationship and your friendship with Lynn Hoffman.
Well,
and what Lynn brought to the game.
Okay, we had been reading what Lynn wrote, and we were invited to the University of, I guess it was Alabama. I don't know if it's in Birmingham, but a university in Birmingham, Alabama. And Lynn Hoffman was going to be the presenter. So we decided that we would go as guests, and we weren't presenting at all. So we did, and Lynn, and so what happened is at the very beginning, as like today, there were technical issues with the video equipment. This was the days in which you traveled with videos and you had pre-selected what you were going to show and what you wanted people to see, and what you had already created the reality around was happening with the family. So they had even called in a technical person, and all of a sudden Harry, one of his nicknames was Columbo. For those of you who've ever seen the old Columbo kind of detective series on television, it was kind of a bumbling guy. Well, Harry just kind of bumbled up and he just said, you know, do you mind if I just take a look? I don't know much about video equipment. Do you mind if I just take a look? And he took a look and he touched a couple of things, and lo and behold, video started playing. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, that's how we met Lynn Hoffman.
Lynn tells me this story too.
Yeah, and then of course we had, you know, lunch and refreshments with her and that kind of thing, and got to know her better, and invited her to come to Galveston and do a workshop. And the first time she did, she wanted to bring Peggy Penn with her. So she and Peggy Penn came and did a workshop for us. And then we had her several times after that. And I think one of the things that connected was that she was into what she and Ken, I keep calling you Ken, Christopher Kinman, were calling communal practices. And we were too, but we were not calling them communal practices. We were calling it collaborative.
Yeah.
And the community could be a classroom. It could be a group of friends, a neighborhood, a village. It could be any kind of community, but it was a collection of people related to someone around something of common interest or common challenge.
Yeah.
Common goal. So I just hung on everything that Lynn said, and Lynn became a role model for me because she was one of the few women in sort of at the guru level in family therapy in those days who was herself, I thought, very respectful, very humble, um, very interested in everybody.
Yeah.
She was what I'll say now. I've never said this about her. She was a human being, and she wasn't lost in an ego.
No.
Yeah, not at all. Or a reputation. She had a lot of humility.
She was also very, very funny.
And she was very funny. Yeah, she had a very, very good sense of humor. I remember funny things that she did and funny stories she told. Like one time she was lecturing at a university and she was the only woman and the only one that wasn't a psychiatrist. And she thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So what she did when she went in, she laid down, it was like a formal auditorium with like what do you call it when there's like a railing, a solid railing, like around the seating area on the stage. And she laid down behind that. And after they introduced her, she kind of popped up and said she peered over a little bit. And then she got more and more and more, and she started talking. She thought, behave in an unexpected way. And I thought, oh, I like that. Behave in a way that people don't expect. Say something that people don't expect. And it began to make me think much more how each of us, and I'll say this for each of you, that you may think, for example, I see Emily's name and Lisa's name and Rachel and Justine and on the screen here, much plus many others, that people think of you the way that you think of yourself, but they don't. That you come with a reputation that someone else has placed upon you. So you come with a part of your identity that maybe you didn't even know about. And so I began to think that's very important when you meet other people, that you meet them as if you are a foreigner, different customs, a different language than they have, and that they're a foreigner for you. And so that I interpreted what Lynn was doing. She was meeting these foreigners as a foreigner with these crazy, unusual customs that they didn't know about. And of course, she was talking about family therapy story at that time.
Well, she was influenced by Marcel, the mime artist. Marcel Mauss? I forget his name, but
she was always very friendly with participants in a conference, whether it was a workshop or a training with 50 people or 500 people, and she would try to know them. And I think that probably in some way that's influenced me, because one of the things that I do, like if I were there with you in person and I was outside, I was going to meet you in your classroom, I would stand at the door and welcome you and introduce myself and ask you your name as you came in. And then as people were seated, I would walk around and talk with you a little bit and ask various people where they worked, what they did, what brought them here today, just as a way of beginning to engage with people and in an informal way, and just to let them know that I'm a human being and I'm not going to be up, behind a podium looking down on you. I'm going to bring the microphone and walk down amongst you. So there are just so many subtle things probably that I do that I think about now as we're talking, that were not only influenced by Harry, but also by Lynn Hoffman.
Oh, I miss her.
Absolutely.
Sometimes she reprimands me, even today. Like I still often use the term mental health, but every time I use it, I can hear her telling me not to use it.
Well, she's that little guardian angel, or fairy godmother sitting on your shoulder, whispering in your ear every now.
Just to change track a bit, I'm wondering if you have a story or two about your work, so that we could kind of, for a moment, just see. And I know there's so many ways this could go, but just a couple of stories about this collaborative
Chris,
style.
did I remember, or did I promise to send you 2 articles?
Yes, you did. I don't think you did, though.
Oh, okay. That's not unusual. So I usually tell people that if I promise them something or they email me and I don't respond, just to do it again. Ask
Well,
me.
within my state right now, it could have come and I didn't see it as well. So,
Okay.
um,
Okay. So I'll tell a story. I can tell a couple of stories. Uh, okay. One, I was doing a workshop in Taipei, Taiwan, and it was like a 3-day workshop. And the second day, the second morning, usually what I do is I ask people to kind of talk with each other and share their reflections on the day before and what are some of the things that have surfaced even louder that they wanted to hear more about, or a question that they were still holding on to that they were fearful that maybe I wouldn't respond to. And this one woman on the front row just waves her hand and waves her hand. And so I call on her and I say, okay, what would you like to offer? She says, I just want to tell a story about last night. And I said, okay. She said, well, every Friday night, and we have done this as my husband and I have been married, which has been for several years. We go to his mother's house. She didn't say my mother-in-law. She said, we go to his mother's house for dinner. And she said, I dread it. But being a good wife and with the, the customs here, I have to go. She said, I just dread it. I can hardly wait to leave. And she said, I just sit there, I eat dinner. I don't say anything. I don't talk. And every time when on the way home, my husband asked me, why are you so rude to my mother? And she said, oh, I wasn't being rude. I just didn't have anything to say. So she said, but last night, she said, I don't know what happened. She said, I walked in my mother-in-law's house, my husband, my mother, but anyway, my husband's mother's house. And she was in the kitchen cooking like she usually is, because usually she'll put dinner on the table. And she often doesn't even join us for dinner. She's just so busy serving and taking care. And she said, I walked in there and I just asked her what she was cooking. And she told me, and then I began asking her, well, where'd you learn to cook that? Or something like that. And she said, so then she said it was time to eat. So we sat down and I said where she wanted me to sit, which was the usual place where I'd been sitting for years. And she said, I started talking with her and with my husband at dinner. She said, I have no idea what happened. And she said, my mother-in-law or my husband's mother was doing what she always does. She complains about everything. And she was complaining about how her shoulders hurt and her neck hurt. And she just had been, cooking all day, preparing this meal. And she said, I don't know what got into me, but I got up and I walked over to her and I said, do you mind if I just give you a little bit of a shoulder rub? And she said, that's what I did. And she said, then we went into another room and sat down, the three of us, and I continued talking with her. We got in the car and my husband said, what happened to you? Have you been drinking or something? And she said, no, nothing alcoholic was served. And she said, I don't know. And then she started saying, I think it was being here and hearing something that I'd never thought about before and talking with my colleagues here about it, that I just somehow it influenced me. Okay, so that's kind of one story. I'll tell another story. And this time I was in another Asian country, not Taiwan, and a woman, a participant, which I usually will ask for a participant to volunteer for me to talk with so people can see and we can all experience it at the same time. So I don't travel with videotapes anymore or even use videotapes in my teaching because I don't want to show someone something that I have edited or pre-selected what I think they should see. I find it a much richer experience if we all, I call it do something together and experience it all together.
Yeah.
So this woman volunteered and I had no idea why she volunteered, what she wanted to talk about until I started talking with her. And I I asked her what she would like to talk about, and she said, a long-standing family problem. And I said, well, a long-standing family problem. I might have asked her something like, I usually say something like, where would you like to start? Or what do you think are the most important things for me to know about this? Or I might even ask who are sort of the characters in the story you're getting ready to tell. So I asked kind of a general question, not for any specific reason other than to invite the person I'm speaking with to talk and to hopefully put them in the limelight, in the spotlight, and put them in the expert position, because I do believe they are the expert. So she began to tell me that this was a situation that involved her favorite and dearly loved uncle and his wife, whom she detested. And she did not like this woman at all. And she said that her grandmother, who had been kind of the host and the glue in the family on this side of the family, which was her mother's side of the family, had always hosted celebratory dinners, like if it was somebody's special birthday or if it was a national holiday. And she said, she's told me that there was a holiday coming up. It was an important Chinese holiday. So this was in mainland China. And so I said, well, okay, so your grandmother used to do this. You kind of inherited the role, and you've been doing it, it sounds like, but you are not wanting to continue doing it. And she agreed, yes, that's right. I have done it, but I don't want to continue doing it. And it's like this next holiday was the test holiday. So we talked, and I just asked her questions. I really ask her questions to learn. And people often say, well, Harlene, how do you know what questions to ask? And I said, I never know ahead of time what questions to ask.
That's right.
I don't have any favorite questions or questions that are important for me to ask. I said, if you listen very carefully to someone telling you something, I think of it as telling a story or narrating about a situation in their life, they will tell you what to ask, because they're telling you a story. I say it's much like reading a really, really good book, and you can hardly wait to turn the page and go to the next page and see what happens next. Or if you're talking to someone who's already read the book, you might say, well, just give me a clue as to what happens next, but don't tell me how it ends. So I just began asking her curious questions to learn more about what she was saying, the story she was telling about this important holiday coming up and her role, and how she didn't want to participate in the way that she had been participating in the role she had been placed in by being the woman. And I guess, if I remember correctly, maybe the oldest woman in the family right now. Her mother had died and her grandmother had died. So, but her grandmother, not her mother, was the one who was the family glue. So we just talked and we talked, and then all of a sudden I became really aware that all these other people were watching and listening, and that it was probably time just to pause. We didn't have a solution. I certainly didn't have a solution for her. She had asked me something like, which clients often do, what would you do if this were you? Or
yeah,
she said something like, tell me what to do. Tell me what you would do if this were you. And my response was something like, well, I'm not sure what I would do or how I would respond. I said, but as you've been talking, I've had 2, 3, maybe even 4 ideas of ways to handle it based on some experiences that I've had in working with other people with situations not exactly like yours, but somewhat similar to do with families and the role in the family. And I said, I don't know if any of them would fit, but if you would like, I could tell you about 2 or 3 of them. And maybe there's something that we could pull out and use and modify it for your situation. And she kind of reluctantly agreed. She said, yeah, tell me what has worked with other people. And so I told her, I think I told her maybe 3 different scenarios. None of them fit. None of them, she knew none of them would work. Didn't surprise me at all, because she just had this kind of attitude that this was a very serious situation and it required a very serious solution. I don't know what she was imagining I would do or how I would help. If I ask her that, I don't remember what she said. I apologize. So we parted ways, and out of the blue, if you give me a moment to find it, I think I can find it somewhere within hand's reach. Out of the blue, a few months later, I received an email, an unsolicited email. I had not said, keep me in touch or let me know what happens or send me a postcard, which is something that I had done for a while with some clients. Well, send me a postcard later and let me know what happened. But anyway, that holiday had come and passed. And she said, I decided not to either invite or not invite my uncle's wife. I would invite him, and it would be up to my uncle to invite her if he wanted to or not. She said, I don't think it's my role to tell him whether to invite her and bring her or not. And I just thought that was very, very, very interesting. But she was just updating me on what happened. So I just responded and I said, well, thank you very much for updating me. Oh, and she said that he came without his wife, and that they did not talk about the wife, and she didn't ask had he invited her or not. They just didn't discuss it. Neither one of them brought it up. And then I got another email from her about 2 months after that. And she said basically kind of the same thing. The very most important Chinese holiday is coming up. And I am not worried. I am not anxious about inviting my uncle and whether or not to invite his wife. She said, that is just not a problem anymore. And she said, I really do believe that he will do what is right for him. And if he wants to invite his wife and he brings her, so be it, basically. Those were her words. Or if he doesn't bring her, she said, I will just pretend this is the usual thing. So again, it's like you can't, I don't think, in the way that I work, and this is very different than the way most family therapists work, is that I do not think I can design a solution for someone else. That everything has to be tailored to the particular person. I'm still looking as I'm talking, and their situation. And it just cannot be designed, because you don't live with your clients.
No.
And one of the things I like to say is that it's almost like when you're working with a family or working with one person or members of a family, that it's like that. It's just a quick blip on the screen of life.
It is.
Yeah, it's just, and it's so, therapy is so out of context with people's everyday lives. Now I'm kind of detouring, but there are just so many things I think about as I'm talking with you, that it's very easy to be the expert, and that if therapy is not working or it's not going well, and we've inherited all of this language like not motivated, in denial,
Yeah.
adult child of an alcoholic. We've developed all kinds of ways to posit the therapy slowness or failure or missing the target as an inner characteristic of a person in the family or the family. And I have found, and I suggest to people that I supervise and train, that you might want to think, okay, how can you posit that or take responsibility for therapy not going well. And if you can just think about that, then how would that allow you to perhaps maybe be a little bit different, or better yet, even begin to see the members of the family differently? Because I think that we create the people sitting in front of us, depending on the descriptions that we carry with us of them. You know, you might look at a referral sheet
Right.
and look at where they live, the city or the area of the city or town they live in, and decide that they're this kind of family or this kind of person. Or you may look at the surname and you think, oh, okay, I know what country they're probably from. I bet they don't even speak English. I mean, you can think of all kinds of things, but you meet that person that you are already beginning to disrespect by your pre-understandings and your previous thoughts of them.
Right.
And worse, I think, Chris, is you're beginning to classify them as a certain kind of person,
Yes.
as having a certain category of problem or fitting a particular kind of diagnosis. And you begin treating that vision of them or that pre-written story of them rather than being able to meet them as the person that they are and learn from them what they want you to know. Often when I meet with people who've been to see multiple other therapists, which is usually called resistant patients,
Yeah.
I'll say, well, tell me, were there, and if so, were there some things that some of the previous therapists that you saw, or counselors, or attorneys, or priests, et cetera, whoever they've been working with, that they didn't understand about you that you're really hoping that I would somehow understand? People love those kinds of questions. They want to, yes, oh my gosh, someone wants to understand. They don't say it, but they do get enthusiastic, and they do begin to tell you all these things about themselves and their lives, and things that you would never even think to ask.
I appreciate your work invites us to see ourselves as one among many, right? As just human beings, or I even like to take it beyond that and just say living creatures.
Living creatures, living with all the other creatures in the community.
Yeah, and learning how to get along together.
Yes.